Okay, so Kevin, if you could just share first who you are, what your story is, how you got to where you are today.
All right. Well, my name is Kevin Harris. Uh, I'm a pastor in the city of Detroit. My church is Nazarene Missionary Baptist Church. I also am the district director for a state representative here in Lansing, Representative Latanya Garrett. Married with, I have an 8-year-old daughter and a 22-year-old daughter. So, by most accounts, people in my circle, friends, they feel that, I'm somewhat successful in the ventures that I've taken on in life. And for those people that don't know me, it kind of catches them off guard when they find out that I spent 14 years incarcerated. I was in prison in the Michigan Department of Corrections for 14 years, and before that, I pretty much was a juvenile delinquent. To make a long story short, you know, by the grace of God, and thank God that I was able to pull myself up by my bootstraps, as they would say, um, working very hard to, turn my life around, and that's what I did. But I grew up um, at the height of the crack era in the city of Detroit. And, we've already had so many different issues, but that was, what was really going on in the era that I came up on the lower east side of Detroit, and then we moved to the west side. Uh, my, the old saying, I grew up in a single parent home, and the neighborhood, the guys on the block, those were my father figures and mentors. So as I was, probably around the 11th grade, I dropped out of high school in the pursuit of fame and riches, as the story would go. Unfortunately, it was very short-lived. You can make a lot of money in the streets. You figure things out, but you don't really understand the bigger context that's going on in terms of law enforcement, in terms of societal norms. You're in your little box, and eventually I got locked up and was faced mandatory minimum drug sentences, and I was 18 years old when I was incarcerated. So I spent all of my late teens incarcerated, and all of my 20s, and some of my early 30s were spent incarcerated. And during that time period, for me, it was a deep soul searching on every level of life that you could think about. Um, there were so many things that you have to go through to survive prison in the first place. So, in a lot of ways, my who I am today is absolutely shaped on who I was in those days. Um, and for a long time, probably halfway through that 14-year experience, I was probably just like, any other kid that was in prison. And first of all, it turned out my whole neighborhood was in there with me. So, it was like we were a prison gang in ourselves. So there were a lot of fights. There was a lot of challenges, everything that you can think of that you would go through and see in prison. I experienced those things. Um, for me, I think, maybe when I got halfway through that experience, I had a lot of different turmoils that happened in my family. My mother was murdered um, while I was incarcerated, and that was a major blow to my life, and it sent me spiraling, down a real bad mental path for a long time. And I had a lot of anger, frustration, and it was very tough. But at some point, for me, I drew on uh, the religious experience of my grandmother,
Mm.
and to my mother to a certain extent. But I really, had to look deep inside of me, and pull out everything I could based on faith in order to turn my circumstances around. Because deep in my heart, I knew I was a better person then. the environment that I was in. So eventually, when my day did come to get released, I was well read, I was well studied. I had became by that time a jailhouse lawyer. Did a lot of paralegal work and studied legal writing. Um, Again, read all the cultural books that there are to read. And for me, more than anything, I felt the call of God on my life um, to get out and to speak to others, young men, and whoever I could in my community about staying on the right path, staying on the straight and narrow. And it's led me to a lot of the things that I'm doing now in the criminal justice aspect. Um, I have an opportunity to influence some things from the state legislature, state legislative position, and then, being a community leader and a pastor in the community. So all those things that I went through, I guess you could say while I was going through them, one of the things I would always think about is I have to find a way for this to pay for me. It's like, I may not have a master's degree from U of M or, Michigan State or U of D or Wayne State, but I have a master's degree, and I would even say a PhD, double PhD, based on the life experiences that I've led and dealing with so many different things. I'm a lawyer without a degree. I'm a psychologist without a degree. There's so many things. I'm a doctor in ministry without a degree because I actually have lived the path and have overcome those things. And my knowledge it came from books, but more than anything, I have the added benefit of having book knowledge as well as experience.
Oh yeah, for sure.
That's kind of who I am and where I am today.
Yeah. So you said you pulled out of your grandma's spirituality and her religion. So did you grow up religious? Were you raised religious?
I actually wasn't. My parents are from Marianna, Arkansas. My grandmother and all of my family was from Marianna, Arkansas, and actually it's the same town as the notorious Chamber Brothers organization that so many people in the world of crime in Detroit know about. But that's where they were from, and they were religious. But I was born in Detroit. I guess in those days, if you ended up pregnant as a young woman, they had to get rid of you.
Right.
So they sent my mother to Detroit with me. And as I was growing up, I was not particularly religious. My mother was not really religious, but I had the experiences of going back and forth down south to visit my grandmother. And that is where, I got a lot of the religious foundation for my life. It was because of that.
And it all became a little bit more relevant to you while you were in.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I've done a little bit of like programming in prisons. So like in Gus Harrison, we did like a creative writing workshop, and in talking to a lot of those men, it seems that that's an experience for a lot of people in prison, is that they come to find religion. It sort of pulls them through. So I was curious how you can speak on like what that culture is in prison towards religion and spirituality.
Well, I think it's interesting. It really is. In a lot of ways, and it's common knowledge that it's almost like it's a running joke a little bit in the black community for certain, that when individuals go to prison, then all of a sudden they become these great religious scholars and these great thinkers, and all of a sudden they're, you'll call back home to your friends and your families, and it's like it's this whole big religious thing, that's going on. With particularly you have Islamic religions, and it's all about this great epiphany. So um, is very spiritual in prison for different reasons. Some are considered nothing more than prison gangs, frankly, under the guise of religion. Some are sincere, but it's really interesting because it's all right there in the same mix. You have all kind of different religions, from Muslims, Christians, Wiccas, atheists. So it's kind of like a melting pot, and you certainly get an opportunity to experience different viewpoints. And it's one of the things that's actually have made me very sharp in what I believe, because I'll say it in church sometimes, that I've had every religious debate you can possibly have under the sun. So whenever somebody wants to debate religion, I'm always ready. There was one forum that we had in prison, and one of the gentlemen, he was in one of the Islamic religions, and his statement was pretty much that our people, I'm talking about blacks, African Americans, we've tried Christianity. Christianity did not work for us. Therefore, if something did not work for us, we need to find out what is the true black man's religion, per se. And, well, I just asked him a simple question. I said, so you mean to tell me you followed the tenets of the Bible? You did the things that the Bible said you should do, and you ended up in here with me? So I don't quite think that's what happened. So you can't blame being in here as Christianity did not work, So again, I've had every debate that you can have. But yeah, it's definitely a good foundational place to find out who you are and what you want to seek, so to speak. So yeah.
Well, while we're on the topics of debates, you're going to debate Coates for a second. So are you familiar with Ta-Nehisi Coates?
A little bit.
Yeah.
Not a whole lot.
Yeah.
A little bit, yes.
So we read this book, We Were 8 Years in Power, which is a compilation of 8 essays he wrote during the Obama presidency. He talks about the Civil War, Malcolm X, housing discrimination, a lot of things. He also wrote a book called Between the World and Me.
Okay.
That was written in 2015. That was kind of his claim to fame.
Okay.
And it was written in the style of like a letter to his son about being a black man in America. And there was an article profiling this book and Coates. It's called The Hard Truths of Ta-Nehisi Coates. And the author writes about how Coates comments on religion in his book. He's very cynical. So I'm going to read a quote from the article.
Okay.
She says, Coates is not a Christian. The heavy force in Between the World and Me, what makes it both unique and bleak, is his atheism. To consider the African American experience without the language of souls and destiny is to strip it of euphemism. And then she quotes Coates saying, there's a kind of optimism specifically within Christianity about the world, about whose side God is on, he said. Well, I didn't have any of that in my background. I had physicality and chaos. And then throughout much of his work, he repeats the phrase, no one is coming to save me. So I'm curious your reaction and thoughts to that.
Yeah, I think it's a very, spiritual worldview when you deal with, and particularly Christianity. You can't deal with Christianity in terms of believing it without a level of faith. One of the young men who's training in the ministry, and he kind of comes from a different, background that sounds similar, but yet he has a desire to go into the ministry. So my conversation with him was, it's going to be very difficult for you to, for me as a pastor to put you in front of our people, and you have all these divergent beliefs. And one of his beliefs was simply, I believe what I can see. I can't see, Jesus. I can't see all of these things that you're talking about. But what I do see is that my people are in poverty, that we're struggling and we're going through, and that, frankly, we've received this religion from the white man, frankly. We were brought over here as slaves and given a religion.
Mm-hmm.
This was forced on us. So I think when you deal with people who don't believe, it's really like walking in two different realms.
Hmm.
It's going to be hard to reconcile. For me, belief in Christ is something that's deeply personal, and it's something that, for me, I've heard from God directly to help me change my life. Me knowing who I was and how I was living, I was the guy who would stay up in the crack house selling drugs for 3 days straight, and I might make $10,000 or $12,000 in that time period, but at the same time, it was like, dealing with the Walking Dead, or in the older days, the Night of the Living Dead. You were in the house, you got your guns, you got your drugs, and you've got your money, and you're just operating like a zombie. And I was a hardcore person in that mentality. The person that I am today, and that person, completely different. I had a drastic experience in my life to be who I am. And it's based on faith. And faith is something that you can't see. Faith is something that you have to experience.
Yeah.
So when it comes to people who are hardened in their belief, I don't try to really debate them or question them, because it's a deeply personal relationship between them and God. When I go into the youth homes and I talk to the young men, and I'll have a conversation with them, many of them, they're very angry. And many of them, as they, one of the problems that I believe we have is that we baby these young men, particularly mothers, single mothers. These young men are their babies. They don't have husbands, or they don't have a steady relationship or father figure. So in a sense, that young man becomes the man of the house, the man of their life, and they kind of shower them with attention growing up. But what happens is, a lot of, particularly with young mothers, they find out as these young men turn 14, 15, and 16 years old, they're still young. They want to have a life. They want to go on a date. A gentleman comes and knocks on their door one day, but their son have a problem with that, and there's a lot of conflict in that. So a lot of times it can cause a rebellion, and the young man goes out and ends up in the streets rebelling against his mom authority because they're angry. So when they're in the youth home, I'll ask them the question. I'll say to them, how do you feel about your father? And oftentimes you'll get different responses. Sometimes they'll say, that's not my father, and I don't use the word nigga, I use the word ninja. But a lot of times that's what they'll say, that ninja ain't my father. I don't know that ninja, And I would ask them the question. I said, so let me ask you this. In the context of religion, if you do not know who your biological father is, one day your biological father shows up in your life and says, son, I'm your father. My reaction as a young man, you're not my father. I don't know you. I could rant and rave, be upset, rejected. But at the end of the day, if I submit a DNA test and my father submits a DNA test, that's still my father. It does not matter if I believe it, if I accept it or not. In a lot of ways, for me, that's the way I view people who are atheists or don't believe or whatever it is. My viewpoint of it is, you can have all the feelings in the world, but you did not get here on your own. This world and earth was not created on your own. You might not know and recognize that this is your father, that there's something bigger than you, a force out here, but that doesn't mean because you can't receive it that it's not so. So in a lot of ways, I look at that same scenario when somebody may feel, well, I'm an atheist, or I don't believe in all that, or I don't believe in well, my viewpoint it is, you just don't know.
Right.
You might not want to accept reality, but put your scientific cap on and figure out how all these things work, the universe works, and when you figure those things out, then I'll follow what you believe. So that's kind of my thought on that.
I like that. I like that analogy. That definitely, I think it makes it more concrete for someone to grasp onto.
Right, absolutely.
Yeah. Well, we could talk forever, but those
Very
are my
true.
questions.
Very true.
Thank you so much for sharing. And yeah, thanks, Kev.
Thank you. No problem. Anytime.